Right, knight and pawn versus rook and pawn. I'm going to ask you to temporarily ignore the fact that this position doesn't seem to fit into the title of this video and just pause the video and decide what would you do here as white between, I'll give you two choices, g4 and f4. Which pawn push are you going to make? So this is actually a game from 1983, and the player with the white pieces played f4, which is the correct pawn push. This is a winning position for white. What's wrong with g4? Because it kind of looks sensible, doesn't it? Your pawn was being attacked, so why not just push it? The problem with g4 is that black will exchange it and bring their knight back to f6. Now your best chance of defending knight and pawn versus rook and pawn, which you can see its position now is if you have to have your knight placed where it can control some key invasion squares while simultaneously attacking the g4 pawn, the stronger side's pawn. If you can get that set up, then it's probably a draw. This position here is a draw. Because the problem white's got is they've got to tie down either the king or the rook to defending g4 whilst it's being attacked. Remember, if we get down to rook versus knight, it's just a draw, provided that the king and the knight don't get separated and we're not sort of, hemmed in the corner, which you can see that's probably going to be the case here if black can snatch that g pawn and just sort of quickly get back to its king. So white's got to defend that pawn with either their king or their rook. If they defend it with their rook, then we can stop the white king getting in because the knight's already controlling d5 and e4, and we can just use our king to stop the white king coming in here. We'll just keep it on e6 or d6, for example. Okay. And if it's defended with the king, then white just isn't making any progress. They have to get their king in to be able to get anywhere here. So a couple of things to say here. The first thing on that is that white would prefer that this g-pawn is back on g2. The attacking side would much prefer that because it means that they probably don't even have to defend it at all. Certainly they need to put a lot less effort into defending it, but they probably don't even need to defend it at all because the only way that the black side can get in and take it, we're probably going to see the g2 pawn swap for the g5 pawn, but then the running out of colours, but the king and the knight have become separated and it's going to be a one version of rook versus knight. So that's the first thing to say, is that the attacking side doesn't want to have this pawn advance far forward. The other thing is that if this entire position was one rank further up the chessboard, this is just a win for white. I mean, you could again pause the video and decide why is it such an easy win for white. It's a very simple win if we're one rank further up the chessboard, and the answer is we just give the exchange back and come in and outflank the black king. We could do that here. We could play rook takes f6 check and king d4, and we are going to be winning this g5 pawn. The problem you've got is that king takes g5 is going to be met by king g7, which is a draw. That's not true one rank further up the board. It's just a win for white. Once you've got your king in front of a fifth rank pawn, then it's just a win. So there's a couple of useful things to say. So yeah, this position would be a draw. The knight's in an ideal defensive setup where it's controlling key invasion squares and simultaneously attacking white's pawn. So back in the original position, the player with the white pieces correctly instead plays f4. Good move. Now if black plays g4, sort of insisting on white's g3 pawn being a weakness, white can actually come back and defend that pawn and slowly make inroads, presumably come back and defend with the rook and then go off with the king. But in fact white doesn't need to. It's very simple. White can just come in straight away with the king, and it's just no good for black. I mean, they might think to clear the road for the g-pawn, already controlling its promotion square, and white has to be careful, but this is not a particular problem. After g3, like, hang on, how are you stopping that g-pawn? Well, rook f6 check does it. If the king goes to the e-file, we fork the king and the knight, so the king has to go to the g-file. Rook g6 check, king f7, rook g4. we're in control of the g-pawn. This king's going to come back and force the knight off the defence of it. It's a very easy win. So g4 doesn't get anywhere for black in this line, and instead we did see in this 1983 game a swapping. But black's got a problem now. They want their knight on either g6 or e6, where it does that job that I talked about. It controls a key invasion square whilst simultaneously attacking the f4 pawn. The problem is if black sort of makes a beeline for that now, with something like knight g7, it's too late, and the white king is in to e5. So in the game, the player with the black pieces realised that and instead played king g7. Now white here played, I guess what's a clever waiting move. I mean, we've already said that we want black wants their knight attacking the f4 pawn, which it is doing here. So that's sort of useful. But we also need it to simultaneously control some key invasion squares, and it's just not doing that there. It could instead, in fact, in a minute, it does make its way to g4 to control a key invasion square, but then it's not attacking the f4 pawn. And the advantage of that for the side with the rook is they haven't got to waste energy defending their f4 pawn. So you need the knight doing both to stand any chance. But black's being a bit stubborn here and insisting on, we want to make this king journey, and black's saying, well, you're not making it at the moment. I'm going to stay on the attack of your f pawn. So white played a clever waiting move. And the reason this is clever is that black can't really move that knight, as just discussed, so instead has to move the king. And if king f7, the rook can come to the h-file, so the knight has to move. And we're going to be making this king journey. And black's like, no, you're not. I'm not going to let you make that complete king journey. I'm going to come in and guard e5. So now black's controlling an invasion square, but not hitting the f-pawn. And that extra freedom for white means that, yeah, they do just slowly make their way in. So this is just one example variation. This position was studied by some guy a long time ago, apparently. But slowly but surely, using zugzwang as one of the main weapons, just like bishop versus knight, zugzwang is one of the main weapons for the attacking side. It's the same here. Zugzwang, that king's got to move. Rook f8 check, king g6, king e6. Now the knight's got to move, and we're just slowly getting there. Rook f7, another zugzwang, knight's got to move again. Be careful, don't take on f5, obviously that would blunder away the win to knight d4 check. Chucking this intermezzo check first of all, king g7. You might want to pause the video here. This is sort of a nice little task for just sort of what I would call basic calculation skills. Is it safe to take that pawn? I don't mean with the rook, obviously, that would be very silly. But is it safe to take that pawn with the king? Because this king's attacking the rook, and black can start firing in some checks. Can they get a perpetual check? Because if they can, you don't want to take that f pawn. That'd be very silly. So check it if you like. The answer is you can. Okay. This check, black runs out of checks straight away. That's maximum distance between the king and the knight when I'm talking about close proximity. But you also need to check this one. You need to check the checks. King e5, knight f3. How's that king going to stay in defense of the rook? Another check. Okay. You had to check that black does indeed run out of checks. So what line was I in the middle of investigating there? Yeah, that was king back to f7 after this clever waiting move. Eventually, the side with the rook does get there if the defending side with the knight was unable to rearrange or to get their pieces into a good setup where particularly the knight was simultaneously, say if it was on the e6 square, simultaneously controlling key invasion squares and attacking that pawn. You do eventually get there. As it turns out, this waiting move, which did force king h7 in the game, which is quite clever, it wasn't even necessary. Okay, the player with the white pieces could play rook a1. Black would sort of desperately try and get their knight to e6 and their king to f6. By the way, the rook coming down meant that the king could come forward because we've relinquished control of the 6th rank. So king f6, this is the journey that black wants to make. If they had time to set that up, it would be a drawn position again. But they just haven't quite got enough time. Okay, so white could have just done that. They played this clever waiting move. They forced king h7 because black didn't fancy the king f7, allowing the rook to the h file, and the rook came down. Okay. Just out of interest, something that should be lurking, and we'll see it again in a position later on in this video, which is actually almost a repeat of something in a previous video. I'll talk about that when I get to it. But something that should be lurking in the back of our minds is that we know how rook versus knight is a win if the knight and the king have become separated, or if the knight's got trapped in the corner. And at any given time, we want to be thinking about, well, do we need our pawn? Can we win without the pawn? Like, we want to make this king journey here. It looks like we can't, but maybe we can. Just do it. Just lose the pawn. This is a win, which someone worked out. I think it's an unnecessary thing to think about, because we can win without doing this, but this would be a win. You've got to be careful here. Okay. King takes f5 and we've gone back to a draw. Knight f8. We've got a drawn version of knight versus rook. But it's all about, ignore the f-pawn, it's all about the king and the knight are trapped in the corner. Now if knight f8, king f7, that knight's got to come to d7 now, and the rook's going to move. We've got mating threats. The king and the knight are getting separated from each other, and that is actually a win for white. But instead, white played rook b1, just sort of not giving up the f-pawn. They just don't need to give up the f-pawn. Black now played king g6. I mean, there's not really much they can do. If king h6, what we're trying to do is either get this knight to move so we can make this king journey, or pin it. We can pin it to the king, and now we're ready to make the king journey. So king g6, and again zugzwang. Black's either got to pin their knight to their own king with king h6, or move their knight. If they move their knight, the king's in. Knight g4, sure, but it's just a temporary. We've already seen this temporary controlling the invasion square, but it's just white's going to get there eventually on that one. So king g6 played, rook h1, knight f6, king d4. It's pretty similar. In the game, black tried to control the invasion square this way, but the white king just sort of wiggled its way in, and black resigned there. Right, next, this is a game from 1965. It's actually Larsen versus Tao. So, thinking again from the point of view of the defending side, which I guess is where this is interesting, how can we, where do we want our knight, and how are we going to stop that black king getting in? Because to make progress, the black king's got to get in. This is an objectively drawn position. At the moment, the white pawn's controlling these squares, and the white knight's controlling the g5 square. So the black king's route in this way is controlled. The problem is that the black king's just going to come straight through the middle. Okay. When it does that, the best square, well, you could pause the video if you wanted and try and work out where's the best square for the knight, or where did Larsen, in Dvoretsky's view, correctly decide was the best square for the knight if the king came that way. And the answer apparently is h5, where it controls a key invasion square f4. Crucially, that's got to be in conjunction with the white king coming to e3 to control the e4 and the d4 squares, so the black king can't get in that way. It's very, very hard, in my view, to see all of that. It's very, very hard to see all the variations that we're about to look at, just a myriad of variations. I apologise in advance because I'm just not going to be able to do them justice. It's just too many variations. I very much doubt that Larsen saw all the variations in some of the moves we're about to see, but he did, I guess, well, we don't know if he did, but it looks like he thought about the position schematically. Where do I want my knight? Where do I want my king? and judged having the king on e3 and preventing, controlling the e4 and the d4 squares was more important than another aspect, which we'll get on to. So yeah, this position is objectively drawn. I think I was in the middle of saying something else there, but I've forgotten what it was. So Larson played knight g3. If Towel had come in this way, we just come back to e4. And black's just getting nowhere there. Okay, there's just nothing going on. The white king's free to sort of move around a bit. Black's getting nowhere. So Tau didn't do that. Tau did come through the middle anyway, 96, and then we saw king f4, rook a4 check, king f3, king e5. There's the knight disappearing to h5, where it controls the f4 square. Rook back to a8, and here's the bit where we saw king e3, exclamation mark. Okay. The point is that, I mean, look, it doesn't look clever because that's going to force us back a rank. But black doesn't want their rook down there. Black actually wants their rook over here. Well, that's where Tau wants the rook, so the f5 pawn advance is being threatened. That's where black wants their rook attacking the knight. So this is where the myriad of different variations comes in, because the Dvoretsky book now goes into why king g3 is a losing move. I mean, the engine has just jumped to -5. It is a losing move because it's allowing the king in, but it's very, very hard to go through all those variations. I'll do it now. I'll go through them all and try to do it justice. But it's not like we're going to remember all of these variations and even be able to take them into a game if we do end up in a rook versus knight. I think we've definitely what's the word? We've definitely sort of wandered into the territory of learning ideas. And even if we're not learning ideas, I guess it's just trust there's a transferable skill in there somewhere. Because this was a game played between two top grandmasters of the time, from 1965, and afterwards it's fairly clear from what I've been reading that lots of grandmasters then analysed this position and spent ages going through all these different variations. Now, we can't prove its causation, but what we can say without a shadow of a doubt is there does seem to be a very strong correlation between the people who want to spend ages and ages analysing all sorts of different variations in a position like this, and the people who are grandmasters. So I'm going to spend a bit of time trying, well, that's what I have been doing on my endgame project, is spending time going through all these different positions, going into the same level of depth, or some of the level of depth, and hoping some of it rubs off, and eventually I'll become a strong chess player, but we'll see how it goes. Anyway, so king g3 is a mistake, because rook h8 gets played and f5 is now being threatened. So knight to f4. Okay. Now, at the time, apparently, Tau spent ages analysing king e4, which is a natural move. The whole point is the king's gone offside, and the black king can't make its way through the middle. And just to show you how hard this is, Tau, who was a world champion, and something, one of the best chess players ever, basically, was mistaken in his belief that knight h5 was no good because of f5. Okay. But now the king's moved to e4. This is actually all right for white. This is now objectively drawn. We'd see all these checks, king chasing the knight round the houses, and after rook g8 pinning the g pawn to the king, knight f2. White's fine. This is actually just a drawn version of knight versus rook. Again, we're controlling a key invasion square there of the black king. That doesn't mean that the king e4 threw away the win, by the way. It's still won here, but what Tau would have to do is give up on the f5 plan and basically return to the original position, which was there. So let's go back to that original position. And it is complicated. This is where I'm going to start sort of going through all the different variations and just trying to do my best to do justice to them. But black can win this with rook h1 and just sort of just slowly, I guess using, it's not really zugzwang because you're not sort of forcing white to move that's instantly lost, but it is just a series of mini zugzwangs. Just keep forcing white to play moves. And that's definitely an idea I've picked up on, by the way. So if I end up in a knight versus rook, I'm going to be very aware that the side with the rook has that extra freedom to just sort of play waiting moves. And if I was the side of the rook, I'll be looking to do it the whole time. So yeah, knight d3 check, king d4, knight to f4, king e4, knight h5, rook f1, and just slowly white's pieces start to become a bit more unfavourably placed. You might see king g2 would be met by rook f3. That looks pretty bad straight away, doesn't it? Because I think the knight's having to go to g7 and then the black king can come into f4. So not king g2, instead king h4. And there's some fun and games here. I mean, this just shows you the time that these guys spend on this. This is 5 moves after king g3, a move that never happened, and we're sort of trying to explain why. Here, black must play rook f2, but not rook f3. Okay, so you think what's the difference between these two? The reason rook f3 doesn't work is that white can play this g5 move. This is something that black should have been on the lookout the entire time. If white can find a way to swap the pawns and get a drawn version of knight versus rook, then yeah, obviously white's going to do that. So this g5 pawn push, black would have to meet it with f5. The problem here is that white can just keep pushing the g-pawn. You're like, uh-oh, how are we stopping that g-pawn? So rook back to f2, not f1, where we'd lose the game to knight g3 check. G-pawn gets pushed, got to get behind that G-pawn. And I actually had a moment where I first saw this, I was thinking, hang on a minute, why is the engine saying that this is 0.0 when surely white can just win this now with knight G3 check? Careful, king f4, if you queen, you're getting mated. So not knight G3 check. Okay, that would actually give the win back to black. But it's a fairly simple draw. We can just queen and pick up the rook, and that knight's clearly going to get back in time to stop that pawn. So not rook f3. You know, what were you thinking of? Rook f3. It has to go to f2. Okay. The point being is that if where was I here? So I got a bit lost on those variations. Oh yeah, sorry. No, I haven't got lost on those variations. King g3, rook f. Now you play rook f3 check. King back to h4. The point being is that the black king is now on e5, which I guess is closer to stopping the promotion of the g-pawn, so that if white tries this g5 move, it doesn't work. But it's also about clearing this rank, as we'll see. So if white now plays this g5 move, f5 fine, g6, the black rook can disappear over here. So if g7, we've got rook a4 check. If king g5, we'd see check, king back, king to f7. So it was important to have the black king close enough to the f7 square. That's completely gone. And if instead king g3, rook g4 check, king f2, king e6, king f3. Now, black kind of wants... sorry, it's this position here. Yeah, black plays king f7. Black wants this position, but with black to move. It's now white to move. Because the point is if it was black to move, black can play rook g5. That forces the white knight to move, and then we can grab the pawn. The problem is that if white plays knight g3 here, rook g5 doesn't attack a knight. So the white king can just come forward. And taking the pawn's obviously useless, because of knight takes f5 check. So black sort of needs to get back to this position with black to move. And yeah, knights don't triangulate, basically, is the principle here. So yeah, black can do a little triangulation to get back to the same position, but crucially with black to move. Rook g5, and the g pawn's falling. It's going to be a fairly straightforward win from there, and the rest is technique, as they say. So g5 doesn't work if we've done that sort of little finesse to get the rook to f3 where the king's on e5 instead of e4. So what if white just says, okay, well, I'm not going to play g5, I'll just sort of wait around with knight g3. And then bring the rook off to the side, knight h5. There's more, not triangulation, but there's more of a zugzwang thing going on here. If the black rook comes to the fourth rank straight away, the white king can come back to g3. So instead, black plays rook b3, and then the knight comes back to g3, and then rook b4. So obviously king g3 is now impossible. The point is that after knight h5, f5 finishes it off, that decides. If knight f5, king can come into f4, we might see king h5, rook b5. This is a nice line. We could basically pre-move rook takes f5 there, even against king g6. I'll leave you to check that out if you want to. That's a winning king and pawn ending. And finally, if white moves their king, king h5, rook back to b8, king g6, we'll see check, check, rook to h4, g5, rook g4. Everyone got all of that? So back to this position then for one reminder. We've covered from here what happens if white plays knight h5, what happens if white plays knight f5, and what happens if white plays king h5, and how black's just winning in all of those lines. But this came from a minute ago where white played knight g3 instead of g5. And if we just go back one move to here, where black's just played this clever waiting move because they don't want king g3 to happen, one last line to cover is rather than knight back to g3, white can play knight g7 here, and it's worth going through this one as well. Rook b7, knight h5, rook h7, king h3, and then f5. Finally, Tao would get in his attack whilst the rook's on the knight, and then yeah, this is bad news for white here. King g3, rook h8, just force that knight to move, knight f4, rook g8, and then this white knight can go on a bit of a checking mission. Knight d3, king e4, knight f2, king e3, knight d1. Knight d1 check, sorry. There is an interesting bit coming up at the end of this particular variation, which is why it's worth seeing as one final variation. King d3, knight f2 check, king e2. White's not finished here. White can play king f4, just give up the knight and hope to go for a drawn version of rook versus pawn. It's not a drawn version of rook versus pawn. Black has only one winning move here, and you could pause the video and try and find it if you wanted to. It's rook f8. Okay, and if you didn't find that, I would recommend, we made a video on rook versus pawn, Reti returns, I called it. It's only a 12-minute video. I'll put it in the video description for this one. It's definitely worth going into because it starts with a puzzle, and then yeah, but you wouldn't get that in a game, would you? This sort of clever little puzzle. And yet here is a game, another one, where it was an important principle. We'll see something later on, admittedly, in a study, where the Reti returns on rook versus pawn video would also have been useful. So I've sort of lost track a little bit of all the various variations there going on. But the point was that in this 1965 game, Larsen versus Tao, is white to play here. And the knight's on h5 doing a good job of controlling this invasion square. So we're looking for a king move. And it's impossible to believe that Tao calculated all of those variations that we've just looked at. Absolutely impossible. I mean, some of them were just computer lines that we've only seen, with the benefit of modern day engines, including supposedly that mistake that made that Tao had analysed. It's impossible. Did I say Larson or Tao? I can't believe it. Sorry, I can't remember. It's impossible to believe that Larson had calculated all of that when he played King E3 ! Not worried about that Rook A3 check. But he sort of just instinctively knew that he wanted to be stopping the black king from getting in to D4 or E4. So everything we just covered there was on what happened if the king went to G3. And it must have been instinct. It's impossible to believe that Larson analysed all of those variations and rejected King G3 because of that. It must have been an instinct thing. But King G3 is in fact a losing move. Anyway, back to the game. Larson played King E3, whether by instinct or whether by luck or whether he did analyse all those variations. The latter I very much doubt. I would believe it's the instinct thing that kicked in, just sort of judging that was more important than the possibility of allowing this check, forcing us back to F2. And yeah, the game carried on, and Tao actually found it very hard to break through. There was lots of manoeuvring about, and this next stage of the game, Dvoretsky just doesn't bother analysing at all, just goes through all the moves. There's a lot of sort of back and forth, and eventually that f-pawn wasn't under attack there, I think, because the rook f4 check. Eventually Tao decides that just to sack this f-pawn and go after like a one version of rook versus knight, because the white king and knight have been separated. We'll see it in a minute. I mean, admittedly, white's got an extra pawn, but that idea is still always lurking there. If you can transpose from pawns being on the board to just sacking a pawn, the pawn's not on the board, but you've got a one version of rook versus knight, just do it. And in the end, it was all Tao could think of to try, because he's tried everything else, as all these moves sort of indicate. Lots of back and forth. Larson refused to budge, and eventually we will see, where is it? There. Okay, so finally gives up the pawn on f6, falls a check, king f4. Now white's got a choice here. The king and the knight have become separated, but white has a g pawn that they can use, and it is going to be the saving vital component of white's defense here. It can't be pushed straight away, because, I mean, believe it or not, the king could actually take that and black's still winning, but even simpler is rook g3 check, come back, and that white knight's already, these squares are controlled by the rook, these squares are controlled by the king. You can see that white's dead. If instead here king h2, then rook back to d6, and the white knight's got to go the wrong way. H7's obviously bad. H5's the one you think is the place for it to go, or g5 protect the knight. Rook d8, where's the white knight going? Well, h5 we said, but the black king can come into g4, and that knight's getting away from its king. It can't come to g3, for example, because of rook d2 check. So not g5 straight away, not king h2. Larson brought his king back towards the middle again. Again, not scared of this check, which did actually happen. King f2, rook d2 check, king e1, rook back to d6, and now g5. Black played king h3. Obviously the white king can't move because that would be checkmate. But the knight went to h7. So rather than the pawn defending the knight's now defending the pawn. And the problem black's got here is that there's no way that he can win this g-pawn without letting the knight back to the king. And we know that's a drawn version of rook versus knight. So Tao tried, there's a little bit more manoeuvring around. King f3, knight back to h7, the rook came to d5. You might be wondering why rook g6 isn't being tried, but that's let the king escape. So king d2, rook g7, knight f6, g-pawn's gone, but the king and the knight are going to be reunited somewhere around the top left hand corner of the board. So rook d5 played in the game, but now Larson just pushed the g-pawn even more. g6, rook d7, knight g5 check, king e3, knight e6, rook d2. This next move is quite nice, using the fact this black king is tied down to defending the rook. That's also a bit of a pain for black as well, actually controlling the g2 square, so black's now got to worry about that g-pawn. Rook h2, threatening checkmate, so we see a check, king f3, white king runs away, and yeah, sure, the g-pawn's getting lost, but we can see that the white knight's getting back to the king there, and it's a drawn version of rook versus knight. Really, really tough game to go through, that one. We've got the principles of trying to use the knight to control key squares and stop the enemy king invasion. And I mean, it did when it was on h5 simultaneously attack f6 and defend that king invasion square of f4. Again, Larson obviously instinctively knew to get their king to e3 to stop the black king getting in. The king g3 lost, but only after extensive analysis and using a computer. So, I mean, I'll leave it up to you what you decide to take away from that and maybe one day use in your games, or is it just a transferable skills? Are we just sort of letting these ideas, like an osmosis thing, going on? I have got one more position coming up where the depth of the variations is just so much that you do start to doubt if you're actually learning anything. But hey, you know, I mean, you could still just persist with it because it's just as entertaining as playing some sort of Mickey Mouse Blitz stuff, isn't it, online? You know, we can't be detrimental to our chess to spend a bit of time going through it. Before that, though, we've got this next one. This is a 1946 position between Taimanov and Bronstein, and this is actually quite interesting. I had to check the references on this one because in a minute this game's about to transpose into exactly the same position as a 1998 game that we already saw in a previous video. Excuse me, and because it was exactly the same, I went back and checked. Is that right? It's like I thought I'd made a mistake and it was actually just the same game, but it was two different games. Anyway, in this game, rook a7 check played, and I mean the black king might think to hide away on h6, but this is hopeless for black. White can just play a waiting move. Zugzwang once again important in rook versus knight. The black king obviously has no moves. You don't really want to move the g-pawn because g5 would be bet my f5. So the black knight basically has to move. Rook down to b3, knight back towards the king, don't let them get separated. Rook h3, there's no sensible moves other than moving the king. But now similar to what Tao had in that game, that knight's only protected by the pawn and the g6 pawn is overworked. Black might think to play king f7, but f6, that's a nice little move, isn't it? And the black knight has no moves. Well, it takes pawn, but then it gets lost to rook f3. So back in this original position, king h6 is no good. And it's for that reason that Bronstein put his king back onto f8. Now here, in the actual game, inexplicably really, Taimanov played f5, Bronstein took it, and a draw happened reasonably soon after that, which is a strange move, really. I mean, you'd have surely spend a bit of time trying to work out, is there a way to win this? Because swapping the pawns isn't good. We're going to get straight to a drawn version of rook versus knight. And the key is that white, similar to one of the things Tao tried in that last game, is that it's not all about trying to win that black pawn. Like, we're quite happy to exchange pawns or possibly even sacrifice that f4 pawn if it means we can get a winning version of rook versus knight, where the black king and knight have become separated. And that's true even if black's still got a pawn on the board. So rather than swap the pawns, the key is to basically sack the f4 pawn. You can't do it straight away because the black knight will get back to its king. Okay, there's the pawns being swapped, and this is now a drawn version of rook versus knight. Done loads of work with those sorts of positions in the first knight versus rook video. So you can't play king e6 straight away, but what you can do, this, I guess we call this the main line, even though it's not what happened in the game, is play rook d7, and it's zugzwang again. Okay, black's got a choice between either going king g8, which has just transposed into that 1998 game, exactly the same position that we've already covered in the last video. I mean, why wouldn't black just play king e8? The problem they've got is the rook comes to h7, and the black king can't get back in time to stop this attack. Once the rook's attacking the knight, the f5 pawn push is being threatened, and yeah, black has no defense to that. So not king e8, but instead king to g8. And now, like I say, we've already covered this exact position, and now we go for the, you know, it looks like this knight's really well placed. It's covering the invasion square, it's attacking the f4 pawn. But white just goes, yeah, well, have my pawn. King e6, knight takes f4 check, the king's in. In that 1998 game, we saw knight g2, king takes g6, and knight back to f4 with check. And we're going to transpose into that because Dvoretsky has as the main line, knight h5 check, king takes g6, knight back to f4 check. King g5, knight e6 check, king to f6. In that game from 1998, it ended like this. Black resigned. So, not such a clever move, knight f8. But the knight's lost. Okay, knight f4, rook back to d4, knight to e2, rook g4 check, king f8, rook to c4. We're controlling the d4 squares, the c3 square. We're also threatening checkmate, so the black king has to move. King g8, king g6, threatening checkmate again, king back to f6, f8, sorry, king g5, and yeah, and the black knight desperately tries to get back, but it has been cornered. And the rest is just, yeah, pretty easy. One other interesting thing to say actually on this, I'll put it back in the starting position, and I'll go back to that Larsen-Tau match, and this is the starting position. So I thought it was very hard to draw this, but it is objectively drawn, and Larsen did it against Tau, who was a world champion. So it's obviously, you know, doable stuff. This position's objectively drawn. We've got a G pawn against an F pawn, and the defending side has the G pawn on their fourth rank. And yet here we've got a G pawn against an F pawn. The defending side has their G pawn on their third rank, and it's just lost. This is already +5, and white would win it in exactly the way we described. Okay, there's the zugzwang, and now you give up the f4 pawn, and eventually win the black knight. There it is, lost again. Let's quickly see it again. Great. So not too bad, that one. Next. So this is a game from 1979. Again, I'm going to apologise in advance for, I'm going to do my very best to do justice to all the different variations we're about to see. At some point, I just sort of had to go with it, and it was almost just like, you're just watching it, like chilling out, watching a game of chess, rather than actually trying to take every single little bit of it in and just hoping that some of it goes in. It's white to play. It's a game from 1979. Yusupov is black. Yusupov was one of Dvoretsky's pupils, I believe. We did a lot of work with him anyway. And he kicks off by saying, oh, when Yusupov showed me this game, I said that what white should do is this. Okay, so what you could do now if you wanted to is pause the video, and bearing in mind all the things that have been discussed about where you set up your pieces as the defender, in terms of stopping the enemy king getting in, see if you can come up with a plan of what white should do. How should white set themselves up to just, I guess almost like as a fortress would be the idea. Have a go at it. So well done if you came up with a good plan. This is what Dvoretsky reckons that white should have done. It wants to stick the knight on h3 and the pawn on g4. Okay. The reason that would be quite useful is that from, and obviously the king on h4, the idea is that from h3 the knight's going to control g5 and f4 with the pawn controlling f5 and h5, and so from h3 it's all ready to jump into g5 and attack the h7 pawn. And if black advances to h6, then at any given time black's got to contend with white pushing their g4 pawn to g5, because if the pawns get swapped, it's a drawn version of rook versus knight. That's not what happened in the game, and that made white's defensive task much harder. But when he suggested this, apparently Yusupov went away and sort of investigated it, and there's, this is just one example variation, but indeed it's actually a reasonably simple way to draw it. So well done if you found that idea. Knight h3, rook a4 check, king h5, rook back to a3, king h4, king into e5, g4. There's the defensive setup that's been reached. Rook a1, king back to g3, h6, king back to h4, black rook comes to h1, king g3, king d4, and then here we could push the g pawn, just as an example. So yeah, it would have been quite easy to draw it like that. This said, in the game knight h5 check was played, and it's still objectively drawn, but the defending task became a lot harder. This game did eventually get drawn, but not before. It had become objectively lost for white on at least 2 occasions. Some of the lines that white needs to play to draw it, though, are astonishing. And we're back to that same idea of what we don't have to think about a pawn for a pawn. Incredibly here, we've already seen some versions in either the last video or the last video but one, where a lone knight is still good enough to draw if it's in the right place in combination with its king against a rook and a pawn. And there's some lines coming up here where that was a possibility for white as well, although I think they were astonishingly hard to see. I'm not sure how you'd ever get from them to like taking away, oh yeah, if I get this in a game I'll do that. It really is just an ideas thing, something that maybe you could think of to try and do if everything else you're looking at seems to lose, and it's like last chance saloon. Anyway, we'll see them. Knight h5 check, king e5, this is how the actual game went, king g5, rook a6, knight f4, king e4. And now white played king g4 exclamation mark. I think it is actually the only drawing move. The king's got to come back to g4. This said, knight h3 sets up a little bit of a trap. Okay, black's only got one winning move here. A very natural but not winning move is king f3. And check this out, because king f3, it looks like that the pawn's just lost. And white's like, yeah, the pawn is lost. King h5. If that pawn gets taken straight away, knight g5, and yeah, we're winning it back, aren't we? Either h6, knight f7, or it's just going to get taken straight away on h7. So instead of that, black plays h6. This h6 move was a very useful move in a lot of the lines when the knight had come to h3, stopping the knight getting back out to g5. There was definitely a distinct sort of lack of space for white in a lot of the lines in this game. But white plays g4, king to g3, and now it looks like white's in big trouble, but g5. How about that? So this knight h3 was a sneaky try. That position is a draw, but black doesn't play king f3. Black plays rook g6 check, king f4, and again not king f3. If king f3, we'd see knight g5, king g2, king h5, rook back to g7, king h6. white's going to round up the h7 pawn. It's a drawn version of rook versus knight. King and the knight close together, not trapped in the corner. So yeah, not king f3, but black is still winning with king back to f5. It's like they haven't made progress, but they have, because white's just sort of a little bit trapped in the corner. Rook h6 check, knight h5, king e4, king g5, rook g6 check, king h4, king f3, king h3, rook to g4. A couple of choices here for white. If knight f6, we've got check, taking the pawn. It looks like a pawn for a pawn, but this rook g6 means that black's going to hold on to their pawn and win. And the other possibility here is king h2, rook back to g5. And yeah, I mean, that's looking very bad news for white in that position, isn't it? So nice try with this knight h3 trick, but it is sort of enticing an error, but objectively it's not the best move, and white played king g4, which is the only move that apparently still draws the game. Rook a5, and then knight e6 played. If knight h3, knight e6 was again the only drawing move. If knight h3, this is now losing position. h6, again white sort of running out of space. King h4, king f3. Look at a couple of possibilities here, neither of which are very good. If g4, we've got rook a4, knight g1 check, king f2, knight h3 check, king g2. Okay, and if instead of g4, white goes knight g1 check straight away, king g2, knight back to h3, rook a1, knight f4 check, king f3, king h5, and the g pawn's fallen. So knight e6 played. Looks like he's getting away from the king, but it was actually the correct move. h6. Again, white finds the only drawing move, which is king h4. If the knight comes back to f4, we'd see rook g5 check, king h4, king f3, knight h5, rook g4 check, king h3, rook a4, knight back to f4, rook back to a1, king h2, king g4. And yeah, the white knight's not particularly well placed, and this g pawn's going to be falling very soon. So instead of knight f4, white played king h4, defending this really well. And it's actually only here that white goes wrong for the first time. And wow, you know, to find the next move, you're not going to find it over the board. It's definitely one of those times where I start to wonder what is the point of this post-match analysis. Finding that, interestingly, this move draws. A natural move to play here might be just knight back to f4, but this is going to run into similar sort of problems as before, where white's just sort of slowly going to run out of moves. We saw that in some of the other variations. In the game, knight d8 was played, and that leads to a loss, although it did actually lead to a draw, believe it or not. Incredibly, I mean, just check this out, just again to try and maybe get ideas rather than think that you're going to find this in an actual game. Knight g7 is the move to play. It just seems to sort of contradict all the principles of, you know, keep your knight close to your king. I mean, and it's gone to the dumb square as well, isn't it? One move away from the corner. What's it doing on g7? I cannot for the life of me think how I would ever think to put my knight on g7, especially when you see the reason it's gone there in some of the follow-up stuff. I mean, rook g5 looks the most sensible move for black here, but let's also look at king f3. G4, rook back to e1, king h5, so you just drop your g pawn, there it goes, and now knight e8. Obviously, you know, knight's coming back to f6, and there's no way for black to make progress. They're not going to be able to hold on to their h pawn. So I mean, can you imagine seeing that back here? Just think, well, I'll put my knight on g7 because it can always, you know, once I've lost my g pawn on g4 with my king on g6, I can always reroute the knight in here. Who finds that stuff? I don't believe that the best players in the world see that sort of stuff easily. But it's interesting, isn't it? Interesting to look at it. So yeah, rook e5. Let's carry on with this knight g7 analysis. I probably would lean towards rook g5 there. Then the knight can come back to h5. It looks like white's running out of space again. I mean, they sort of are. King f3. Then the knight hops to f6. Rook g6. Again, only one move. Draws here. Not knight h5. That's the natural. Bring the knight back towards the king. That's the correct move. Rook g4 check, king h3, rook d4, then knight to f6, rook d1. King has to come to h2, rook d6, and yeah, you can see that white's basically busted there. So back in this position, the correct move is knight h7. You're like, what? How's that working? I'll have your g-pawn. King h5, rook h3 check to protect the h-pawn, then king g6. And again, this is just a draw. This can't get pushed straight away because that would fork the king and the rook, and it is, you have to check that's still a draw. You can nab on h5 afterwards, and you can. But if that black pawn doesn't move, this knight's coming here and here, and it's getting round. The h-pawn's getting rounded up anyway. So yeah, after playing like 3 or 4 only moves in a row, white finally goes wrong in this position with knight d8. By the way, when I say 3 or 4 only moves in a row, just contrast that with the original position, where the simple sort of, think about it schematically, think about where you want your pieces. And it's very easy to say in retrospect, but this setup of controlling key invasion squares with pawn and knight, and if the h-pawn doesn't move, this is always on the horizon, and if the h-pawn does move, this is always on the horizon. Yeah. That's not beyond us, is it? All those ridiculous moves there with you want your knight on g7, then you want your knight on h7, all that stuff, I think that's ridiculous. That certainly is beyond me. I speak for myself possibly, but that's way beyond me. But having a position like this on the board is like, okay, I've got a knight versus a rook. What do I do? Where do I want my knight? Where do I want my king? Where do I want my pawn? What's the best setup to make it very, very hard for the opposition to break through? And if you've gone for that setup, I mean, one of the things that Dvoretsky writes about is that it's not like in the variation that we then saw that white's moves were forced. You know, I mean, after rook a1, I'm looking down the engine's list of moves. All 5 of them are still a draw, the 5 best moves. After the next one, this time you've got a choice of just 2. Okay, so it's not only move. And I'll just do a couple more. Well, this time you've only got 1, which is king back to g3. One more, and even there, g5 is played because it sort of forces the issue. But the top 5 engine moves all lead to a drawn position. Whereas in the line we saw, where white's finally gone wrong with knight d8 by not thinking about a plan, if you like, from the beginning, this is now lost for white. The knight's got too far away from the king. So king f5 played, knight to c6. If instead the knight went to f7, rook d5, not rook e1. Rook e1 would chuck away the win. It just shows how hard it is for both sides, doesn't it? Because you get g4 check, king f6, knight d6, and yeah, the white knight's going to get back to a useful square. So rook d5, and yeah, this is quite a nice line. If knight takes h6 check, just trying to get, not so much grabbing the pawn, but trying to get back to the king. King g6, the knight can't go to g4, obviously, because rook h5 would be mate. But it goes to g8, it's lost. Okay, so knight f7 in this position, bad idea. Knight c6 played, rook e4 check, king went to h5, And king e6 was played, but it's written in the book that king f6 was simpler, a simpler way to get the win. Just keep the white king sort of hemmed in. King takes h6, rook c4, knight to b8. That knight sort of really running out of squares. Then come for the knight with king e6, king h5, king d6. G pawn gets pushed, rook b4. What black wants to try and do here is round up that knight with the rook and keep the king close to being able to stop the g pawn. Don't want to start, chasing it away with the king. Knight a6, rook a4, knight back to b8. The knight's lost. It may as well drag the king one square out of position, but king takes c6. I'll leave you to count that out. On a rook versus pawn, it's a very easy winning version of rook versus pawn. So king f6 was a bit simpler. In the game, king e6 was played. White grabbed the h pawn, and now black played king d7, which isn't great. Simpler than that, with the white knight already cut off from its king, is to just take the complication of there being a g pawn to worry about. Just take it out of the equation. There was time to round up the g pawn and still keep the knight away from its king. So rook g4, knight d8 check, for example, king f6, or if king h5, then just grab the g pawn. Was there one other line I was going to look at there? Oh yeah, sorry, yeah, then carrying on with this line. So yeah, knight d4 check, king e5, we might see king h4, rook e3, and yeah, the knight's being separated from its king there, isn't it? There was time here to go and grab the g pawn, but Yusupov played king d7, knight a5. It's still winning for black, and Yusupov finds the best move. Rook b4, exclamation mark, just controlling some of these squares that the knight is trying to escape to. This time, by the way, it's too late to play rook g4. If rook g4 here, the knight escapes and it gets back to its king. Okay, so rook b4 played instead. King g7, king c7. King c7 is the final move that throws it away. I'm not going into the details, but apparently king e6 keeps the win. It's very complicated because you're trying to trap the knight, trying to corner it whilst it's away from its king, but you've always got this to contend with. So you're trying to keep your king close enough that you get a winning version of rook versus pawn, but also it's got to be sort of close enough over here to help round up the knight. But king e6 wins, king c7 throws away the win. And then white plays king f6. The really clever thing about king f6 is that if we finally come in for that knight, which is now trapped, white just pushes the g pawn. If we take the knight, that's a trivially drawn version of rook versus pawn. So the only sensible thing to do really is grab the pawn and try and keep the knight away from the king, but you're not going to be able to. Okay. Rook b3, knight b3, rook b4. This is worth a pause of the video moment. White to play. What would you do here? How are you going to get the knight back to the king? A mistake would be knight d2. The problem with knight d2 is that it can't go to the f file. So in knight d2, this square is already controlled by the rook. These two squares are also controlled by an impending rook f4 check. So d2 was not a very clever place to put the knight. But knight c1, there's no way that the black rook can control both of these squares on its next move. And then whichever one of those squares the knight goes to, it's got, if I just did that one in blue, I mean, from d3, it's got these squares, hasn't it? And from e2, it's got these squares. There's a lot of squares. It's getting back to its king. It's impossible to stop it getting back to its king there. So black didn't play king b6. King back to d6 instead. G pawn got pushed and nabbed, and then knight b7 check. That is actually the only move to carry on. Knight b3 runs into trouble after king d5. So knight b7 check. The knight's dumb square again. How would you know to put it there? I guess you'd have to. I guess you have to calculate it really. There's a few enough variations there now, isn't it? We could start thinking about actually calculating it again. This is what happened in the game. King d5, knight d8. You can see the knight's coming back to its king. And a draw was agreed there. So that was an incredibly tough position to go through. Apologies if I didn't capture absolutely everything in all of those variations. You felt like you were getting a bit lost. I certainly felt like I was getting a bit lost in all of those variations. But I reckon there's something useful in all of that. I'm definitely going to go through it again. It's all a bit more light-hearted or easier from now on. One more game situation to go through, and then 2 positions which are just a bit of fun to end this video on, because I feel like on this particular knight and pawn versus rook and pawn, I've been working hard. I feel like I've gone to football training and they've been doing like press ups and sit ups and things, and it's like, come on, let's play some football. I felt a bit like that when I was going through this knight and pawn versus rook and pawn. So I have got some fun positions to go through in a minute. But first of all, this is a game from 1983. It is black to play, and this ended up in the tragi-comedies section. So yeah, I mean, here's a good question to just it's worth pausing the video here actually. See if you can find a really bad move for black that just, it looks plausible, but it's just bad. Pause the video and see if you can find it. So well done if you found the game continuation, which was king e4. Dreadful move, and just a falling asleep type move, to be honest. White played g3. We saw knight f3. Obviously that pawn can't be taken. That pawn gets taken. Black's lost their knight in the game. I mean, they've lost the game anyway. But the game actually went knight f3, rook g4. Uh-oh, f pawn's going. Knight d4 check, king f2, knight back to e6. Pawn takes on f4. That pawn still can't be taken back because the knight's lost. Knight d4, f5 check, and black resigned because the next move is going to be rook takes d4, whether black defends their knight or not. So how about that? And it really was a bit of a tragi-comedy, because this game is drawn. Although black only has one drawing move, again you could try and pause the video and find it. It's quite clever how this works as well actually. It's knight back to g6. If the white king comes to d3, we could see knight e5 check, king d4, and how about that for a move? f3, rook f8 check, king g4, king takes e5, f takes g2, king e4, king g3. Nice little try there at the end, wasn't there, with the king e4 trying to pick up what will be a black queen on g1. Yeah, draw. So it would have been an easy draw for black if they'd just found in the original position. Well, first of all, just don't play king e4. But then, yeah, it turns out that knight g6 is the move they have to play to draw it. With that pushing, getting on with pushing the f pawn, even if it means losing the knight, it's still a draw. Right, now it's time for a bit of, relatively speaking, fun. Moving on to this book. Brilliant book. 100 Endgame Studies You Must Know, which I interpret more as 20, 40, possibly as many as 60 endgame studies that are really good fun and well worth going into to get a feel for the pieces and just the power of the pieces that you would never think of. And then another 40 odd puzzles that are just off the wall, and you can live your life quite happily without ever knowing anything about any of them. But brilliant book, absolutely brilliant book. Let's look at a couple of positions from it. This one's from 1986. This one's not so detached from just sort of principles that are going to help us in these positions. Like, we're studying rook versus knight, so hopefully somewhere in this video, you know, we've learned something that's going to help us if we ever end up in a rook and a pawn versus a knight and a pawn. But I would suggest, without being able to prove it, that most of what we're doing here is about training our brain to think about chess pieces and what they can do in ways that will help us think differently and find ideas of the board that we wouldn't have found otherwise. And I think that's what this book does. At the very minimum, it's just fun. But this position also includes the former as well. If you think about what's white trying to achieve, what's black trying to achieve. So it's white to play. What does white do here? The opening move is quite easy to find. c4 check. And the black king comes to e5. So the question is, where do we want the white rook? Because what's black trying to do? Well, black's trying to win this pawn. And they don't even care if this pawn then goes. They're looking for a drawn version of knight versus rook. So if we don't move the rook somewhere that defends this pawn, it's not going to take long for black to attack it and round it up before our king can get in and help by defending c4, either by taking on c5 or making its way to b5. Who knows? So the most natural thing you might think to play is king h4. Rook h4, sorry. The problem with rook h4 is that it's gone to a square where the black knight can pick up, gain a tempo by attacking it on the way back. So knight e1, the white king makes a beeline for the c5 pawn. Well, not so much of a beeline because the black king's controlling the as the crow flies sort of thing. So I guess, is that a B that goes around the corner like that? So it's the red line a crow and the green line a B. Who knows? Maybe we should give up on this metaphor. King d7, knight f3, there's the extra tempo. The white rook comes to g4. Knight d2 attacks the c pawn, and when the white king comes in, it's too late. The white rook is out of squares. Can't even go to e4. Okay, so that's covered, that's covered, that's covered, that's covered. The white rook has to move, the c4 pawn's gone, it's a draw. So back in this position, rook h4 doesn't cut it, and you have to play rook g4. This time, knight e1's not a very clever route to attacking this c pawn, because the king moves, and I mean clearly knight f3 doesn't achieve anything because it's not even attacking a rook, and the king could come to c6. So if instead black plays king f5, then the rook can slide to h4. If the black king keeps moving, then it's sort of nowhere near now, so we can just move our rook back to h3. Or if knight f3 attacking the rook now, rook h5 check picks up the c5 pawn. So knight e1, a waste of time in that line. Instead, black might think to play knight b2, attacking this straight off, and still threatening to come over here, by the way. Okay, all right, the e4 square's no longer covered because there isn't a knight on f2, but this is covered, and we could get a pendulum going on here with the king controlling all of those squares. So black is threatening to get that white rook off the fourth rank and defense of that c4 pawn, where the black knight could just take it. If the white king just comes in, attack, attack, and we will see that aforementioned pendulum. I mean, that's one way the game could end in a draw. Another way is that white just moves their rook and drops the c pawn, and the game will also end in a draw. So king d7 is no good. So what does white do? In the original position, you can't move your rook to h4 because of knight e1. You have to move it to g4, but then black attacks the c pawn, and now still if you bring your king in, you're running out of squares. Well, here's the finesse. Rook h4. How about that? It's absolutely brilliant. It's because the knight's already committed to going this way. It's now one move behind this path to gain a tempo. mean, it can gain a tempo that way, but it's already lost one, so it would have to lose the tempo it's gaining coming back. Yeah, so absolutely brilliant. Rook h4, and the point is that if the black king comes after the rook now, it's well now our B line has turned into, was it a crow? Was it a bee? I've forgotten which animal I used, but yeah, we can now head straight for the c5 pawn. King g5, rook e4, king back to f5, king d5, and yeah, we might see knight a4, but I could just play anything here, really, couldn't they? That you can see that eventually that's gonna go. The engine's saying rook e5, but we can just go and attack. I don't know what I was playing rook e5 check for, but we can go and attack the black knight and win the c pawn and win the game. So king f5, no good. There's one more interesting thing. I think this has cropped up already in one of the other positions earlier. This video is going to have gone on for so long that I can't actually remember now. But the last thing that black might try to do is knight takes c4 and go for a drawn version of rook versus pawn, pushing the c pawn. And we are back to rook versus pawn, Reti returns. I think I've already said it this video. I'm going to put rook versus pawn, Reti returns in the description to this video, so you can sort of go back and remind yourself of that clever little trick, which we see again here. The white king gets back just in time to round up the c pawn. One last position. This one's just definitely fun. I don't think there are any principles going on here. This is where the knight's going to beat the rook by promoting. We're going to try and promote the e-pawn using our knight to stop the rook from stopping us from doing so. If that English made any sense at all. So pause the video. White to play. If you're bored senseless having listened to this video for a long time, maybe just end the video now and come back to it tomorrow or something. Come back to it another day just to see the solution if you don't get it. But this one's really good fun. Also in this book. So yeah, I'd recommend. It's from 1939. Someone came up with this. Well done to them. Great little study composition in my view. So what does white do? Well, white pushes the e-pawn, e7. Couple of choices here for black. One that makes sense is rook back to g8. And if knight f8, we might see queening, king takes g1, and rook g5. You might be wondering what on earth is going on there. Why might you see that? I'll come back to that, why the rook might have gone to g5, because we're going to transpose. But arguably a more sensible move to play would be rook g1, where white's got to deal with the e-pawn. So king takes e2, rook g8, knight f8, blocking the rook's defense of e8. But the black rook does defend e8 with rook g5. Okay. Is that an exact transposition? Nearly. The other one had the king on e1. But that rook g5 does indirectly defend e8, which hopefully you've worked out why. How does that defend e8? So what are you going to do about it? Like, we can't queen because of rook e5 check, and it's going to be a stalemate or rook versus knight. In fact, probably a winning version of rook versus knight. So white would end up losing that if they don't play queen takes e5 stalemate. So what does white do in this position? This is like the thunderbolt. What's the word? The pinnacle, the centerpiece of this study. I've forgotten the word. It's annoying. The highlight. I'm saying all the words that skirt around the edge of the word I'm trying to think of. White to play. What do they do? Well done if you found knight g6. How amazing is that move? Knight g6. You're stopping the white rook coming to e5, and you're blowing away the stalemate trick. It doesn't matter how that's taken, rook or king. We're queening. and rook e5 check does nothing. We'll just take it, or rook e6 check if you know, nothing. Just queen takes e6. It's not stalemate at all. You might have thought to play knight d7, which I think is still winning, but you go around in circles because after rook g8, the only winning move is knight f8. So you go back. So you do have to find knight g6 at some point. Anyway, nice to finish on that one. That was a pretty cool study. I enjoyed that one. That video's gone on for a long time. I'm having to put it together by compiling 2 separate videos because someone knocked on my front door at the wrong time and it messed up the sound. But yeah, I've lost track of how long that is. But for anyone who's still watching it, I hope you found that useful.